In a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and winding roads, life moved at its own gentle pace. The air always smelled faintly of fresh grass and blooming flowers, and people knew each other by name. Among them lived Eleanor Grayson, a Yawazari woman whose presence blended seamlessly into the fabric of the town. To her neighbors, she was just the friendly librarian who spent her days organizing books and tending to her small garden. She wasn't one to draw attention to herself. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, smiled politely when greeted, and kept mostly to herself. But beneath this unassuming exterior lay a mind sharper than anyone could have imagined. Eleanor had not always been so reserved. Years ago, before moving to this sleepy town, she had been someone entirely different. At the peak of her academic career, she graduated top of her class from one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. Her professors called her a prodigy, marveling at how effortlessly she dissected complex cases and crafted arguments that left even seasoned lawyers speechless. After graduation, she joined a high-profile firm where success came naturally to her. Yet, despite all her achievements, something inside her changed after a personal tragedy struck, a loss too painful to bear. Without warning, she walked away from her thriving career, leaving behind everything that reminded her of her past life. No explanations, no goodbyes, just silence. Now, years later, Eleanor found solace in simplicity. Her mornings began with a cup of tea as she watered her plants, followed by long hours at the library, where she helped children find their favorite storybooks or assisted elderly patrons with research. People admired her kindness but never suspected there was more to her than met the eye. They assumed she was content living an ordinary life, far removed from the pressures of ambition and competition. And perhaps they were right, at least on the surface. But fate has a way of disrupting even the calmest lives. One sunny afternoon, while driving home from the grocery store, Eleanor found herself caught in a minor traffic altercation. A sleek black sports car zoomed past her, swerving dangerously close to her modest sedan. Startled, she honked her horn, only for the driver to slam on his brakes abruptly, causing her to bump lightly into his rear bumper. It was barely a scratch, nothing serious enough to warrant more than an apology. However, the man behind the wheel, a wealthy developer named Victor Langston, was not satisfied with such a resolution. Victor stepped out of his car, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with Eleanor's plain cardigan and jeans. His face twisted with anger as he inspected the insignificant dent on his bumper. "You're paying for this," he snapped, pointing a finger at her. Eleanor remained calm, explaining that the accident was unavoidable given his reckless driving. But Victor wasn't listening. He demanded compensation on the spot, threatening to involve the police if she refused. Reluctantly, Eleanor agreed to exchange insurance information, hoping the matter would end there. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, Victor wasn't just any developer. He was a man with deep pockets and powerful connections. Among those connections was Judge Harold Whitmore, a figure whose name carried weight in the local courthouse. Whitmore was known for his domineering demeanor and questionable ethics. Over the years, he had built a reputation for bending laws to serve his interests or those of influential friends. When Victor approached him about the incident, painting Eleanor as careless and irresponsible, Whitmore saw an opportunity to flex his authority. To Whitmore, Eleanor appeared like an easy target, a quiet, unassuming woman without the resources or knowledge to fight back. What he didn't realize was that he was dealing with someone far more formidable than he could imagine. As the case made its way to court, Whitmore began orchestrating events to ensure victory. He dismissed key evidence that might exonerate. Eleanor leaned on potential witnesses to stay silent and encouraged Victor to exaggerate the extent of the damage to his car. Every move he made seemed calculated to crush Eleanor under the weight of the legal system. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Eleanor showed no signs of panic. On the contrary, she seemed almost amused by the situation. She attended pre-trial hearings dressed in her usual understated clothes, nodding politely as Whitmore issued rulings clearly biased in Victor's favor. Outside the courtroom, however, Eleanor transformed. Sitting alone at her kitchen table late at night, she pored over legal documents, revisiting concepts and strategies she hadn't touched in years. Her mind worked tirelessly, piecing together a plan that would expose Whitmore's manipulations and turn the tables on him. What Whitmore failed to understand, and what Eleanor fully intended to exploit, was that intelligence is often underestimated when wrapped in humility. While he assumed she was clueless and vulnerable, Eleanor was quietly sharpening her tools, preparing to strike where it hurt the most. For now, she let him believe he was winning, biding her time until the moment was right. Little did he know the simple woman he sought to frame was about to become his greatest challenge yet. This unfolding drama set the stage for a battle unlike any the town had seen before. On one side stood Judge Whitmore, arrogant and convinced of his invincibility. On the other stood Eleanor Grayson, outwardly meek but inwardly a force to be reckoned with. As the pieces fell into place, the question lingered. Would Whitmore's hubris lead to his downfall, or would Eleanor's brilliance remain hidden forever? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: the quiet librarian was done being underestimated. The days following the traffic altercation turned Eleanor's quiet life upside down. What began as a minor inconvenience quickly escalated into something far more sinister, thanks to Judge Harold Whitmore and Victor Langston's determination to paint her as the villain. The case was officially set for trial, and Eleanor found herself thrust into a world she had long left behind, a world of legal maneuvering, accusations, and power plays. Yet, unlike others who might have been overwhelmed by the situation, Eleanor approached it with a calmness that bordered on eerie. To those observing from the outside, she seemed almost passive, as if resigned to her fate. But inside, her mind was working overtime. Judge Whitmore wasted no time stacking the odds against her. From the very first hearing, it became clear that fairness wasn't part of his agenda. He scheduled hearings at inconvenient times, knowing full well that Eleanor didn't have a lawyer to guide her through the process. When she requested copies of police reports or witness statements, he delayed providing them, citing administrative errors that conveniently favored Victor. Even worse, he allowed Victor's team to present exaggerated claims about the damage to his car, despite obvious inconsistencies in their account. It was all part of Whitmore's plan to make Eleanor look incompetent and guilty by default. Victor, emboldened by Whitmore's support, grew increasingly aggressive. He hired a mechanic to testify that the dent in his bumper was caused by Eleanor's vehicle, even though the timeline didn't add up. Photos of the damaged car were submitted as evidence, but something about them felt off to Eleanor. She noticed subtle details, the angle of the light, the placement of certain scratches that suggested the images might have been staged. Still, she said nothing during the early stages of the trial, choosing instead to listen carefully and take mental notes. What neither Whitmore nor Victor realized was that Eleanor wasn't just listening. She was analyzing every word, every action, and every decision they made. Her years away from the courtroom hadn't dulled her skills. If anything, they had sharpened her instincts. As a young lawyer, she had learned to spot patterns where others saw chaos, to identify weaknesses in arguments that seemed airtight. Now, sitting silently in the defendant's chair, she applied those same principles to dismantle Whitmore's carefully constructed web of deceit. One evening, after another grueling day in court, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers. She had photocopied every document related to the case, poring over them until her eyes ached. There, hidden within the fine print of the mechanic's report, she found what she needed: proof that the damage to Victor's car predated the accident. According to maintenance records, the bumper had been repaired months earlier due to a separate incident. This revelation alone was enough to discredit Victor's entire claim, but Eleanor knew better than to reveal her hand too soon. Instead, she tucked the discovery away, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. Meanwhile, Whitmore continued to underestimate her. During one particularly tense hearing, he openly mocked Eleanor for not hiring a lawyer, suggesting that her lack of representation proved her incompetence. "Mrs. Grayson," he said condescendingly, "perhaps you should consider seeking professional help. Navigating the legal system isn't something amateurs can handle." His comment elicited a few smirks from the gallery, but Eleanor simply nodded politely, her expression unreadable. Inside, however, she bristled, not out of anger, but because she recognized the insult for what it truly was, an attempt to intimidate her into submission. Eleanor's patience was strategic, not passive. She understood that Whitmore thrived on control, feeding off the fear and confusion of those he deemed inferior. By refusing to rise to his bait, she denied him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. In fact, she used his arrogance to her advantage. Every time he dismissed her as harmless, every time he assumed she wouldn't catch his tricks, she gained another piece of ammunition to use against him later. And while he busied himself manipulating the proceedings, Eleanor focused on building her defense brick by brick. Her next move came unexpectedly during a routine cross-examination of Victor's mechanic. Up until this point, Eleanor had barely spoken in court, letting Whitmore and Victor dominate the narrative. But when the mechanic took the stand, confidently asserting that the damage was fresh and directly linked to the collision, Eleanor leaned forward slightly in her seat. Her voice, soft yet steady, cut through the tension in the room. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, addressing the mechanic. "You mentioned in your report that the bumper was severely compromised during the incident. Can you clarify exactly what you mean by that?" The mechanic hesitated, clearly unprepared for such a direct question. "Well, it means the impact caused significant structural damage," he stammered. "And yet," Eleanor continued, holding up a copy of the maintenance records, "your own shop serviced this same bumper 6 months ago for similar damage. Isn't it possible that the current condition of the bumper is unrelated to the recent accident?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the mechanic fumbled for an explanation. Whitmore, visibly irritated, tried to intervene, accusing Eleanor of badgering the witness. But the damage was done. For the first time, cracks began to appear in Victor's polished facade, and Whitmore's confidence wavered ever so slightly. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread among spectators who had watched the exchange unfold. Some admired Eleanor's composure under pressure, while others speculated about how someone so unassuming could possess such insight. Even Victor seemed uneasy, his bravado faltering as he realized Eleanor might not be the pushover he'd anticipated. Back home that night, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile as she reviewed the day's events. She knew the battle was far from over. Whitmore still held considerable power, and Victor wouldn't give up without a fight. But she also knew she had struck the first blow, planting seeds of doubt that would grow with each passing day. With every calculated move, she chipped away at their advantage, exposing the flaws in their strategy while keeping her own cards close to her chest. As the trial progressed, Eleanor remained steadfast in her resolve. She understood that justice rarely came easily, especially when faced with opponents like Whitmore and Victor. But she also believed in the strength of truth and the power of preparation. And so, she prepared meticulously, knowing that the real showdown was yet to come. For now, she bided her time, waiting for the right moment to strike again, a moment when Whitmore's hubris would blind him completely, leaving him vulnerable to the full force of her intellect. Though the road ahead promised challenges, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. For years, she had lived quietly, content to let the world pass her by. But now, she stood ready to reclaim a piece of herself, to prove that beneath the surface of simplicity lay a brilliance capable of turning the tables on even the most formidable adversaries. The trial entered its third week, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Whitmore, growing increasingly frustrated by Eleanor's unexpected resistance, decided to tighten his grip on the proceedings. He issued orders that seemed designed to overwhelm her, demanding irrelevant documents, scheduling hearings at odd hours, and even attempting to disqualify key pieces of evidence she had painstakingly gathered. To an outsider, it might have appeared as though Whitmore was simply enforcing strict legal protocols. But Eleanor saw through his tactics. They were deliberate attempts to wear her down, to make her stumble under the weight of bureaucracy. Yet, Eleanor remained unfazed. If anything, Whitmore's overreach only fueled her determination. She adapted quickly, learning to navigate the labyrinth of rules he threw at her. Late nights became her ally as she combed through case law, studying, obscure statutes and precedents that could counter his maneuvers. Her kitchen table transformed into a makeshift war room, cluttered with notes, highlighted documents, and sticky tabs marking crucial passages. Every ruling Whitmore handed down, every objection he sustained or overruled, was scrutinized by Eleanor for loopholes and inconsistencies. Slowly but surely, she began assembling a strategy that would not only defend herself, but expose the judge's corruption. One particularly grueling day, Whitmore dismissed a critical piece of evidence Eleanor had submitted, a photograph showing the condition of Victor's car before the accident. The photo clearly indicated pre-existing damage, which contradicted Victor's claims. When Eleanor protested, Whitmore silenced her with a sharp rebuke, citing procedural technicalities. "This is a court of law, Mrs. Grayson," he snapped, "not a free-for-all where anyone can submit whatever they please." Eleanor didn't argue further. Instead, she filed a motion requesting clarification on the admissibility of photographic evidence, a move so dry and technical that Whitmore barely paid attention to it. What he failed to realize was that this seemingly innocuous request opened the door for Eleanor to introduce additional supporting materials later. Once again, her quiet persistence turned what seemed like a defeat into a calculated step forward. As the trial dragged on, Eleanor noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The jury, initially swayed by Whitmore's authoritative demeanor and Victor's polished testimony, began to show signs of doubt. They exchanged glances during key moments, their expressions betraying confusion, or perhaps skepticism, about the narrative being presented. Eleanor seized these opportunities, using them to chip away at the prosecution's credibility. During cross-examinations, she asked pointed questions that forced witnesses to backtrack or contradict themselves. Her tone remained calm and respectful, never rising to match Whitmore's condescension. This approach not only disarmed her opponents but also earned her quiet respect from the jury. Her breakthrough came during the testimony of Victor's mechanic, Mr. Reynolds. Earlier, Eleanor had exposed discrepancies in his initial statements, planting seeds of doubt about the authenticity of the alleged damage. Now, as Reynolds returned to the stand to clarify his earlier remarks, Eleanor prepared to deliver another blow. Armed with copies of repair invoices, maintenance logs, and expert opinions she had quietly gathered, she methodically dismantled his credibility. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her voice steady and measured, "you testified last week that the bumper was severely compromised due to the collision. Yet, according to these records, your shop replaced the same bumper 6 months ago after a prior incident. Can you explain why the damage appears identical in both cases?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. I don't recall the specifics," he stammered. "Maybe there was some residual weakness." Eleanor nodded politely as if accepting his explanation, then produced a series of photographs taken by her neighbor shortly after the accident. The images clearly showed minimal impact to her own vehicle, raising questions about how such minor contact could cause extensive damage to Victor's luxury car. "If the force of the collision was strong enough to compromise the bumper, wouldn't we expect to see corresponding damage here?" she asked, pointing to her car in the photos. Whitmore, sensing trouble, interjected sharply. "Objection, irrelevant speculation, Your Honor," Eleanor replied without missing a beat. "I'm merely asking the witness to reconcile his testimony with the physical evidence. Isn't that what we're here to determine?" The courtroom fell silent as Whitmore hesitated. Striking down her question outright would look suspicious, especially since it directly addressed the central issue of the case. Reluctantly, he allowed the line of questioning to continue. By the time Eleanor finished, Mr. Reynolds looked visibly shaken, his earlier confidence shattered. Even the jury members leaned forward, exchanging meaningful looks as they absorbed the implications of her argument. Outside the courtroom, whispers spread among spectators who had witnessed the exchange. Some openly praised Eleanor's poise and intelligence, while others speculated about whether Whitmore's bias was becoming too obvious. For his part, Victor grew increasingly agitated, pacing nervously outside the courtroom during breaks. His once cocky demeanor had given way to unease, and he began snapping at his lawyers whenever they suggested alternative strategies. Despite these victories, Eleanor knew the fight was far from over. Whitmore still held significant power, and he wasn't about to let her gain the upper hand without a fight. In fact, his frustration only made him more dangerous. At one point, he attempted to impose hefty fines on Eleanor for filing what he called frivolous motions. Another time, he threatened to hold her in contempt of court when she questioned the validity of certain exhibits introduced by Victor's team. Each time, Eleanor responded with the same unflappable calmness, countering his accusations with meticulous references to legal codes and precedents. What truly unnerved Whitmore, however, was Eleanor's ability to stay several steps ahead of him. Just as he thought he had cornered her, she would produce a new piece of evidence or raise a previously overlooked legal principle that forced him to reconsider his tactics. It was as if she were playing chess while he was stuck guessing at checkers. His irritation boiled over during one heated exchange when Eleanor cited a rarely invoked rule that directly challenged his authority. Slamming his gavel, he barked, "Mrs. Grayson, do you think this is some kind of game?" She met his glare with a serene smile. "No, Your Honor," she said softly. "This is justice." By the end of the third week, the tide had begun to turn. The jury no longer accepted Whitmore's rulings at face value, and Victor's team struggled to maintain their narrative in the face of Eleanor's relentless scrutiny. Even the media took notice, with local reporters speculating about the unusual dynamics of the trial. Headlines like "Librarian Takes on Wealthy Developer" and "David vs. Goliath in Small-Town Courtroom" started appearing in newspapers, drawing attention to the unfolding drama. For Eleanor, the growing public interest was both a blessing and a challenge. On one hand, it put additional pressure on Whitmore to act impartially, or risk damaging his reputation. On the other hand, it also meant she couldn't afford any mistakes. Every word she spoke, every document she filed had to be flawless. She spent countless hours refining her arguments, ensuring that each step she took was grounded in logic and supported by irrefutable facts. As she prepared for the next phase of the trial, Eleanor reflected on how far she had come. From the quiet, librarian content to blend into the background, she had emerged as a formidable opponent capable of challenging even the most entrenched powers. Yet she felt no sense of triumph, not yet. There was still work to be done, truths to uncover, and justice to serve. And so she pressed on, her focus unwavering, her resolve stronger than ever. The real showdown loomed just around the corner. Whitmore, desperate to regain control, would undoubtedly escalate his efforts to discredit her. But Eleanor was ready. She had spent years honing her skills, and now she intended to use them not just to protect herself, but to expose the rot at the heart of the system. For the first time in years, she felt alive, not because of the conflict itself, but because she knew she was fighting for something greater than herself. As the trial moved into its fourth week, Judge Whitmore's frustration reached a boiling point. Every attempt he made to corner Eleanor only seemed to backfire, exposing cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The courtroom had become a battleground, and while Whitmore wielded his gavel like a weapon, Eleanor countered with precision and patience. Her quiet brilliance was starting to unravel the threads of corruption that had long been woven into the fabric of the local legal system. But Eleanor knew she couldn't win this fight alone, not against someone as entrenched in power as Whitmore. It was time to bring reinforcements. Late one evening, after another exhausting day in court, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table surrounded by piles of documents. She sifted through old newspaper clippings, financial records, and archived lawsuits, searching for anything that might connect Whitmore to broader patterns of misconduct. Her instincts told her there was more to his behavior than mere arrogance. He was protecting something, or someone. As she dug deeper, a name kept appearing: Victor Langston. Beyond their current alliance in this case, it seemed the two men shared a history of dubious dealings. Contracts awarded under suspicious circumstances, property disputes resolved in favor of Langston's companies, and hushed settlements all pointed to a web of corruption spanning years. Eleanor realized that taking down Whitmore wouldn't just require exposing his actions in this trial, It would mean dismantling the entire network he relied on. But how? She needed someone who could shine a light on these dark corners, someone fearless enough to investigate further. That's when she remembered Rachel Meyer, an investigative journalist known for her tenacity and integrity. Rachel had recently published a series of articles exposing municipal corruption in nearby towns, earning both praise and threats. If anyone could help Eleanor expose Whitmore, it was her. The next morning, Eleanor visited the county archives, under the pretense of researching historical land deeds. In reality, she was gathering evidence, photocopying files, jotting down notes, and snapping photos of incriminating documents. By the end of the day, she had compiled a dossier detailing Whitmore's questionable decisions, including instances where he had ruled in favor of Langston despite overwhelming evidence against him. With the folder tucked securely under her arm, she drove to the small office where Rachel worked. Rachel greeted her with curiosity, intrigued by the unassuming woman standing before her clutching a stack of papers. "You said you have information about Judge Whitmore?" Rachel asked, raising an eyebrow. Eleanor nodded and handed over the dossier. For the next hour, she explained everything: the traffic incident, the rigged trial, and the connections between Whitmore and Langston. Rachel listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to disbelief as she flipped through the documents. "This is explosive," she murmured finally. "If even half of this checks out, it's career-ending stuff." Over the next few days, Rachel dove headfirst into the investigation. She interviewed former courthouse employees, reviewed public records, and pieced together a timeline of Whitmore's unethical behavior. Meanwhile, Eleanor returned to the courtroom, maintaining her outward composure while secretly fueling the growing scandal behind the scenes. When Rachel's exposé hit the front page of the local newspaper, it sent shockwaves through the community. The headline read, "Judge Whitmore Under Fire, Allegations of Corruption and Bias Rock Local Courthouse." Whitmore was blindsided. He arrived at the courthouse the following morning to find reporters camped outside, microphones thrust toward him as he tried to push past them. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Jurors whispered nervously, unsure whether they should continue deliberating given the allegations swirling around the judge. Even Victor seemed rattled, his usual confidence replaced by visible anxiety. For the first time, Whitmore appeared less like the untouchable authority figure and more like a man desperately trying to hold on to his crumbling empire. But Whitmore wasn't ready to concede defeat. Instead, he lashed out, accusing Eleanor of orchestrating the media circus to derail the trial. During a heated hearing, he slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding that she explain herself. "Mrs. Grayson," he barked, "is it true that you provided information to the press?" Eleanor rose slowly, her demeanor calm but resolute. "Your Honor," she replied, "I am merely a citizen seeking justice. If others have chosen to investigate matters related to this case, that is beyond my control." Her response infuriated Whitmore, but it also trapped him. Denying the allegations outright would look defensive, while addressing them directly risked validating the claims. Cornered, he doubled down on his efforts to discredit Eleanor, issuing subpoenas for irrelevant documents and delaying proceedings in hopes of buying time. But the damage was already done. Public opinion had shifted dramatically, and the pressure on Whitmore mounted with each passing day. Back at home, Eleanor monitored the fallout closely. She knew the media attention was a double-edged sword. It brought much-needed scrutiny to Whitmore's actions, but also put her squarely in the spotlight. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate her, some expressing gratitude for standing up to a powerful figure who had long intimidated the town. Others warned her to be careful, reminding her of Whitmore's influence and the lengths he might go to protect himself. Despite the risks, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about holding someone accountable for abusing their power. In court, Eleanor continued to dismantle Whitmore's attempts to sway the outcome. When he dismissed key witnesses or suppressed evidence, she cited procedural violations and demanded transparency. Each objection she raised added another layer of complexity to the trial, forcing Whitmore to justify his rulings under increasing scrutiny. At one point, he lost his temper entirely, shouting at her in open court. "Enough of your games, Mrs. Grayson," he roared, his face red with anger. "Do you think you can outsmart me?" The gallery erupted in murmurs, and several jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor remained unfazed, meeting Whitmore's glare with a steady gaze. "I'm not playing games, Your Honor," she said softly. "I'm asking for fairness, a principle this court is supposed to uphold." Her words struck a chord, not just with the jury, but with everyone watching. Whitmore's outburst only reinforced the perception that he was losing control, both of the trial and of himself. Reporters covering the case seized on the moment, capturing photos of the visibly agitated judge and publishing stories that painted him as unstable and biased. The narrative was shifting, and Eleanor was at the center of it all, no longer the quiet librarian but a symbol of resistance against systemic injustice. As the days passed, the strain on Whitmore became evident. He grew increasingly erratic, making impulsive decisions that undermined his credibility. At one point, he attempted to dismiss the entire jury, claiming they were incapable of rendering a fair verdict. His motion was denied by a higher court, further humiliating him. Meanwhile, Victor's lawyers scrambled to salvage their case, but without Whitmore's backing, their arguments fell flat. The once airtight prosecution began to crumble, piece by piece. For Eleanor, the turning point came during closing arguments. Standing before the jury, she delivered a speech that was equal parts impassioned and methodical. She recounted the events leading up to the trial, highlighting every inconsistency, every manipulated detail, and every violation of due process. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke about the importance of accountability, not just for her sake, but for the sake of everyone affected by Whitmore's abuses. "Justice isn't about winning or losing," she concluded. "It's about truth, and the truth is something no amount of power can suppress." When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Whitmore seemed momentarily stunned by the weight of her words. As the jury retired to deliberate, Eleanor allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the tragedy that had driven her away from the legal world to the quiet life she had built in this small town. Now she stood on the brink of vindication, not just for herself but for countless others who had suffered under Whitmore's rule. The final verdict was still pending, but Eleanor knew the tide had turned irreversibly. Whitmore's grip on the courtroom and on the town was slipping, and there was no going back. Whatever happened next, she was prepared to face it. After all, she had spent years hiding in plain sight. Now she was stepping fully into the light, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the jury filed back in after hours of deliberation. Every eye was fixed on them, waiting for the verdict that would decide not only Eleanor's fate, but also Judge Whitmore's reputation, or what remained of it. The tension was palpable, like a storm about to break. Eleanor sat calmly at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, exuding the same quiet confidence she had shown throughout the trial. Across the room, Victor Langston fidgeted nervously, while Judge Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual air of authority replaced by something closer to desperation. When the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, the silence was deafening. "We find the defendant, Eleanor Grayson, not guilty," he announced firmly. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by murmurs of disbelief and relief. For Eleanor, the moment was bittersweet. She felt no triumph over Victor or Whitmore, only a deep sense of vindication. After weeks of relentless attacks and manipulations, the truth had finally prevailed. But the battle wasn't over yet. While the jury's decision cleared her name, it did little to address the systemic corruption that had allowed this case to spiral so far out of control. Whitmore, however, refused to accept defeat gracefully. As the courtroom erupted into chaos, with reporters rushing to capture reactions and spectators exchanging shocked glances, he banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. When the noise subsided, he addressed the court in a voice laced with barely contained fury. "This is an outrage," he declared, glaring at Eleanor. Mrs. Grayson may have escaped accountability today, but mark my words, justice will prevail. Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, she rose slowly, her expression calm but piercing. Your Honor, she said, her tone measured yet firm, justice has already prevailed. What remains now is accountability for those who abuse their power and distort the very system they are sworn to uphold. Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Whitmore turned red, sputtering indignantly, but before he could respond, Rachel Meyer, the investigative journalist who had exposed his misconduct, entered the courtroom, accompanied by two officials from the State Judicial Oversight Committee. They approached the bench, handing Whitmore a formal notice. He was under investigation for judicial misconduct, bribery, and conspiracy. The document listed numerous allegations, including evidence uncovered during Rachel's investigation and corroborated by Eleanor's findings. For the first time, Whitmore looked genuinely shaken. His bravado crumbled as he read the charges, his hands trembling slightly. He tried to protest, claiming the accusations were baseless and politically motivated, but his arguments sounded hollow even to himself. The oversight officials informed him that he was being placed on administrative leave pending further review, effectively stripping him of his authority. As they escorted him out of the courtroom, cameras flashed wildly, capturing the image of the once mighty judge walking away, in disgrace. It was a scene no one in the small town would soon forget. Victor Langston fared no better. With Whitmore's support gone, his legal team scrambled to salvage what they could, but the foundation of their case had already collapsed. Facing mounting scrutiny from both the media and law enforcement, Victor issued a public apology and agreed to settle all claims against Eleanor. He also withdrew his original complaint, acknowledging that the damage to his car predated the accident. Though these concessions came too late to repair his tarnished reputation, they signaled the beginning of his downfall. Within days, investigators began looking into his business practices, uncovering a trail of unethical dealings and fraudulent activities that went far beyond this single incident. As the dust settled, Eleanor found herself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters clamored for interviews, neighbors showered her with praise, and strangers sent letters thanking her for standing up to corruption. Yet, despite the attention, she remained grounded, refusing to let the accolades distract her from the larger mission at hand. She knew that exposing Whitmore and Langston was just the tip of the iceberg. The rot ran deeper than any one individual. If real change were to happen, it would require sustained effort and vigilance. Determined to make a difference, Eleanor reached out to Rachel Meyer again, this time proposing a collaboration. Together, they launched a grassroots initiative aimed at promoting transparency and accountability within the local legal system. They organized community forums where residents could voice concerns, created educational materials explaining citizens' rights, and advocated for reforms to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. Eleanor also began mentoring young, aspiring lawyers, sharing her knowledge and experiences to inspire a new generation of ethical practitioners. Her work quickly gained traction, drawing support from across the town and beyond. Local leaders eager to distance themselves from Whitmore's scandal pledged their backing, while national organizations praised her efforts as a model for combating systemic corruption. Even skeptics who had initially doubted her motives came around, recognizing the sincerity and impact of her actions. Slowly but surely, Eleanor transformed from a reluctant participant in the trial into a catalyst for meaningful change. Yet amidst the whirlwind of activity, Eleanor never lost sight of why she had fought so hard in the first place. Justice, to her, wasn't about revenge or personal glory. It was about creating a world where fairness and integrity weren't exceptions but the norm. And though she knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, she faced it with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the trial. One evening, as she tended to her garden, Eleanor reflected on everything that had transpired. The flowers she had planted months earlier were now blooming vibrantly, their colors bright against the fading light of sunset. She smiled softly, finding comfort in the simple beauty around her. Life had returned to its peaceful rhythm, but She knew she was no longer the same woman who had quietly blended into the background. The experience had awakened something within her, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished anytime soon. As she watered the plants, a neighbor stopped by to thank her once more for everything she had done. Eleanor listened politely, nodding with a warm smile. When the conversation ended, she turned back to her garden, her thoughts drifting to the future. She didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but she was ready to face it head-on. After all, she had spent years hiding in plain sight. Now she was stepping fully into the light, not because she sought recognition, but because she believed in the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. And so, Eleanor continued her journey, not as a victim or a hero, but as someone committed to making the world a little fairer, one step at a time. Months after the trial concluded, the small town began to feel like a different place altogether. The shadow of Judge Harold Whitmore's corruption had loomed large for years, but now it was lifting, replaced by a renewed sense of hope and accountability. Whitmore himself was nowhere to be seen. His name became synonymous with disgrace as investigations uncovered a web of bribery, rigged verdicts, and unethical alliances stretching back decades. Facing mounting evidence against him, he resigned from his position and retreated from public life, leaving behind a legacy of shame. Some whispered that he had moved to another state under an assumed name, while others claimed he spent his days holed up in a remote cabin, haunted by the collapse of his once unshakable empire. Victor Langston fared little better. Once a towering figure in the community, he found himself ostracized and vilified. His businesses crumbled under the weight of lawsuits and regulatory probes, exposing years of fraudulent practices. Investors pulled out, employees lost their jobs, and creditors lined up at his door. In a desperate bid to salvage what remained of his fortune, Victor sold off properties and assets, but it wasn't enough to stave off bankruptcy. Eventually, he disappeared from the public eye altogether, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale about greed and hubris. For Eleanor Grayson, life returned to its quiet rhythm, but not entirely. Though she resumed her routines at the ICJ library and her peaceful mornings tending to her garden, she carried with her a newfound purpose. Her role in exposing Whitmore and Langston had ignited something within her, a desire to ensure that no one else would suffer injustice at the hands of those meant to protect them. She didn't seek fame or recognition. Instead, she channeled her energy into creating lasting change. Eleanor's grassroots initiative, born out of collaboration with Rachel Meyer, grew rapidly. What started as a small effort to educate residents about their legal rights evolved into a statewide movement advocating for judicial reform. Town hall meetings drew crowds eager to learn how they could hold institutions accountable. Local schools invited Eleanor to speak to students about the importance of integrity and civic responsibility. Even lawmakers took notice, introducing legislation aimed at increasing transparency in court proceedings and establishing independent oversight committees to monitor judicial conduct. Rachel played a crucial part in amplifying Eleanor's message. Her articles continued to shed light on systemic issues, inspiring others to join the fight for justice. Together, they formed an unlikely yet powerful partnership. Eleanor, the quiet strategist with unparalleled legal expertise, and Rachel, the fearless journalist unafraid to challenge authority. Their combined efforts brought attention to cases long ignored, giving voice to those who had been silenced by power imbalances. Despite her growing influence, Eleanor remained humble. She declined offers to run for office or accept prestigious awards, preferring to stay rooted in the community she loved. Instead, she focused on mentoring young people interested in law, hosting weekly workshops at the library where she shared insights from her own experiences. Many of her mentees went on to pursue careers in advocacy, carrying forward her vision of fairness and equality. One particularly memorable moment came when a group of high school students presented Eleanor with a handmade plaque during a workshop. It read, "To Ms. Grayson, our hero who taught us that justice starts with courage." Eleanor accepted it with tears in her eyes, touched by their gratitude. For so long she had doubted her ability to make a difference. Now, seeing the impact of her actions reflected in the next generation filled her with pride. The ripple effects of Eleanor's stand extended far beyond the courtroom. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began organizing neighborhood watch programs and volunteer initiatives. Business owners adopted ethical practices, fearing the kind of scrutiny that had toppled Langston. Even the courthouse underwent significant changes with new leadership committed to restoring trust in the legal system. Judges were required to undergo ethics training, and stricter guidelines were implemented to prevent conflicts of interest. Life in the town slowly transformed, not through grand gestures, but through small, meaningful acts of courage and integrity. People realized that justice wasn't just the responsibility of judges or lawyers, it belonged to everyone. And Eleanor had shown them that even the quietest voices could spark monumental change. As time passed, Eleanor allowed herself moments of reflection. Sitting on her porch one evening, she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The flowers in her garden swayed gently in the breeze, their vibrant colors a testament to patience and care. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain of loss, the years spent hiding her brilliance, and the unexpected turn of events that had thrust her back into the world she had left behind. She realized she wasn't the same person she had been before the trial. The experience had awakened parts of her she thought were gone forever. Her confidence, her passion for justice, and her belief in the power of truth. Yet, despite everything, she still cherished the simplicity of her life. She liked shelving books at the library, chatting with patrons, and planting seeds in her garden. These small joys reminded her that heroism wasn't defined by dramatic acts but by staying true to oneself, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Her neighbors often remarked on how much Eleanor had changed, and yet how much she hadn't. She was still the kind, reserved woman they had always known. But there was a quiet strength about her now, a certainty in her step and clarity in her gaze. They admired her not because she sought admiration, but because she embodied qualities they aspired to: resilience, humility, and unwavering moral conviction. One day, as Eleanor walked home from the library, a young girl stopped her on the sidewalk. Clutching a storybook to her chest, the child asked shyly, "Are you the lady who beat the bad judge?" Eleanor knelt down to meet the girl's curious eyes. "I didn't do it alone," she replied with a gentle smile. "Sometimes standing up for what's right takes help from lots of people." The girl nodded thoughtfully, then added, "You're really brave." Eleanor chuckled softly, touched by the compliment. "Thank you," she said. "But remember, bravery isn't about being fearless, it's about doing what's right even when you're scared." With that, she stood up and continued walking, leaving the girl to ponder her words. As she reached her front gate, Eleanor paused to look back at the bustling street behind her. Life moved on, as it always did, but she knew the lessons of this chapter would linger, for her, for the town, and for anyone who dared to believe they could make a difference. And so, Eleanor Grayson returned to her quiet existence, content in the knowledge that she had done her part. She didn't need statues or monuments to immortalize her name. Her legacy lived in the hearts of those she had inspired. From the pages of forgotten case files to the whispers of a grateful community, her story served as a reminder that sometimes the simplest among us hold the greatest power to change the world.